Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled, and Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Reish Nun Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn the halachas of Iruvei Chatzeros. We pick up today on the very top line of Reish Nun Amud Aleph in the Shulchan Aruch with the words of the Ramah in Siman Shin Pei Beis Sif Aleph. Our learning today should be as chos for Achenu Kobeis Yisrael Hanesunim Batzaru Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachim Alehem V'Yetziam Yitzar Lervacha Me'afelu La'ira Mishibud L'Geula Hashta Bagolo V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be as chos for Refuah Shalema for Achi Agadol Meshemer Ben Esther Fradl for Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha Rivka Bashir Leah Chava Hadassah Bas Rezel Serel Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malkachana and Yerucham Ben Masha. They should all have Refuah Shalema B'Soich Shar Chayei Yisrael. So, here in Siman Shin Pei Beis, we have been discussing the ramifications of an Eino Yehudi who lives in a Chotzer. So, we know that the Takanas Chazal of Iruvei Chatzeros, when you have a Chotzer that serves more than one Balabayas, it's serving more than one entity. So, the basic case, Reuven has a house, Shimon has a house, there's a Chotzer, Reuven and Shimon aser on each other. The Chotzer is serving both Reuven and Shimon. Of course, what's the Eitzah? They join in the Iruvei Chatzeros, now they're one entity. Well, how about if you have an Eino Yehudi living in the Chotzer? So you've got Reuven, Shimon, and Tony. Is Tony considered a resident of the Chotzer in the world of Iruvei Chatzeros? Does Tony aser on Reuven and Shimon? What we learned yesterday is that really may Ikar Adin, in the world of Iruvei Chatzeros, in the context of the halachas of Iruvei Chatzeros, we do not recognize the residency of an Eino Yehudi as being a resident of the Chotzer. But that's only true me Ikar Adin. While me Ikar Adin that's true, Chazal said that it depends. If you only have one Yid and one Eino Yehudi, then we're not going to say that the Eino Yehudi asers on the Yehudi. But if you already have a situation where you need an Iruvei Chatzeros, if you have two or more Yidden living in the Chotzer, and they live in two separate houses, and we're talking about two Yidden in two separate houses who would aser on each other themselves, so you have Reuven living in one house, Shimon living in another house, they're both independent balabatim, they're not family members eating at one table or anything else. So then Reuven and Shimon already aser on each other. Now Tony is also going to be a problem. What do you have to do? You can't include Tony in the Iruvei Chatzeros. What do you have to do? You have to go over to Tony and you have to be maskir rishus. You have to go to him. You have to make a business deal with him. You have to tell him that, listen, complicated rabbinical stuff, we need to rent from you your rights in the courtyard, your rents of the Chotzer, if you don't mind. Listen, it helps us out with our Sabbath laws, with carrying in the Chotzer, in the courtyard, etc., etc. No biggie. Here, we're going to give you $1 or whatever it is, and it has no real ramifications for you. You're going to rent out to us your rights in the Chotzer. Now, why is it that Chazal said that it's necessary to be maskir rishus from the Eino Yehudi when you have two or more Yisraelim living in the Chotzer, but not when it's only one Yisrael living in the Chotzer? Because the Chazal said that's not shchiach. It's not commonplace that a Yid would be living in a Chotzer only with him and an Eino Yehudi. That's not commonplace. And therefore, like we see all over Shas, the Chazal did not make their takanas in uncommon situations. This is an uncommon situation, and therefore the takana would not apply. Now, on that note, says the Ramah here at the top of Reish Nun Amud Aleph, Hago, here's another interesting case. Let's say you have a situation like this. You've got Reuven and Shimon live in a Chotzer. Now, Reuven happens to own two houses in this Chotzer. He lives in one house, and he has another house. The second house, he rents out. It's an Airbnb. It's a vacation rental. whatever it is. He rents out, I don't want to use the case actually of an Airbnb or a vacation rental because that's going to get us into halachas that we learned earlier. How long is the person staying, etc., etc. He has a rental property. So he's got his house, Ruvain, that he lives in. Shimon's got his house that he lives in. And then Ruvain owns another house in the Chotzer, which is a rental property. He rents it out. Now what happened? Yisrael shehiskir, Yisrael who rented out a hishil or lent out Beisai, his home, le'ena Yehudi, to an Eina Yehudi. So Ruvain had this rental property and he rented it out to Tony. Now let's do the math. Before Ruvain rented that rental property out to Tony, all you had in this chutzner was Ruvain and Shimon. Okay? Ruvain and Shimon, if they want, they could make it a Ruvain Chatzeros. Now Ruvain rented out his rental property to Tony. So now you've got Ruvain, Shimon, and Tony. Now, since you have two Yidden over here in two separate houses, Tony becomes an issue, and you should have to be maskir rishus from Tony. Says the Ramah, in this case, where Ruvain's renting out to Tony, it's not necessary to be maskir rishus from Tony. Yisrael shehiskir hishel beis Eina Yehudi einoi oiser alav. Now Tony does not aser on Ruvain and Shimon. And therefore, Ruvain and Shimon could go make an Ruvain Chatzeros, and they could ignore Tony. They don't have to deal with him. They don't have to go be maskir rishus from him. And the Ramah explains his rationale, which is very interesting. Says the Ramah, Deloi hiskir hishel loy beisai kedei sheyeser alav. Because Ruvain says, look, when I made this deal with Tony, I did it for my benefit. I did it so I could make a few dollars. That's why I rented it out to Tony. I have a rental property. I'm in business. I want to make money, right? That's why I did it. I didn't make the deal with Tony to hurt myself. I didn't make the deal with Tony so that now I can't make it a Ruvain Chatzeros in my Chotzer unless I go through the whole issue of being maskir rishus from Tony. And that's a valid argument, says the Ramah over here. He brings it down for the Magid Mishnah. The Magid Mishnah is actually quoting a Rashba, which is interesting in light of what we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah. But that's the argument that the Magid Mishnah brings down from the Rashba. That's Tony's argument. I did it, I rented out to Tony for my benefit, not to harm myself. Now, I think what lays behind that argument is that in reality what Ruvain is saying is like this. I made a deal with Tony. There's an underlying assumption that when I go make a deal with somebody, I'm not doing it to hurt myself, right? I'm doing it to benefit myself. Therefore, the argument becomes, you're telling me that when we have an Eina Yehudi in the Chotzer, and we have two or more Yidden, there's a rishus that the Eina Yehudi has that I need to rent from him. Well, argues Ruvain, whatever that rishus is that I would have to rent from Ruvain, when I rented my house to Ruvain, I never included that rishus in my rental. Because I did the rental deal to benefit myself, not to harm myself. So whatever that intangible, maybe somewhat unidentifiable, whatever that ambiguous rishus is that you're telling me Tony has, that normally I would have to give him $1 and I would have to rent it from him, what I'm saying is I never rented it to him, that I should have to rent it back from him. Because when I made the rental deal with Tony, I did it to benefit myself, not to hurt myself. That's the argument over here, it seems, that the Magid Mishnah, that the Ramah is putting forth in the name of the Magid Mishnah, who quotes it from the Rashba. Now let's see an interesting Mishnah Berurah here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Zayin, Deloi Hiskir. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ubesefer Avodas HaKodesh leHaRashba, but if you look at the Sefer Avodas HaKodesh from the Rashba, so in the Rashba's own words, Kosav Oid Tam Ledinze, the Rashba himself puts forth an additional argument why we don't have to reckon with Tony, why we don't have to worry about Tony here. And that is what I mentioned in the preface to the shir. She'ein darkoi shel Yisrael lahaskir oy lahashir la'akum bayis b'chotzer. It's not commonplace for a Yid to rent out or to loan out a house to an Eina Yehudi in a chotzer shehu shari b'soicha, where he lives. That's not commonplace. A Yid wants to live in a Yiddish neighborhood. When a Yid goes to buy a house, they speak to the realtor, and they say, tell me about the other houses on the block, right? They want to rent on a Yiddish block. They want to have Yiddish neighbors. So if you have if you have Reuven living in a chutzner together with Shimon, and Reuven has a rental property, Reuven doesn't want to rent it out to Tony. Reuven doesn't want to be listening to rock and roll on Shabbos afternoon. He doesn't want to be smelling pork roasting on the grill. He doesn't want to be watching sizzling cheeseburgers. That's not what he wants. He wants to hear Zmiris coming out of the rental property on Shabbos afternoon. He wants to see a Yid sitting and learning Daf Yomi outside on the porch. That's what he wants. So says the Rashba, it's not commonplace that you would have such a situation where Reuven would be renting out that rental property to Tony. Therefore, now it's not Shchiach. If it's not Shchiach, then the Takanas Chachamim doesn't apply, because the Takanas Chachamim does not apply to situations that are not commonplace. Let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah. If we have a chance, I want to see a bir halach here. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter, V'loi gazr chachamim b'darish she'eina matzli. The chachamim did not make their gzeris, they did not apply their gzeris to situations that are not commonplace. V'ayin b'bir agra, take a look at the bir agra b'kan over here in this Siman in Shulchan Aruch. Ula'el b'siman shin ayin, shedaito, it's the opinion of the Gra, the dafka b'shehisna hamaskir oyamashil. This halacha is only true if Reuven, when he rented out the house to Tony, did it with a condition. What's the condition? Sheyachal l'salkoi b'chol shosha yirtze. Says the Gra, the only time we can say that we don't have to deal with Tony's residency in the chutzner because he rented out a rental from Reuven, the only time we could see that is if when Reuven rented it out to Tony, there was a clause. And that clause was, look, we don't have a lease. We're not even month to month. I could ask you to leave at any point that I want, and you're going to leave. In that case, Tony's residency in the chutzner is very, very weak. It's very, very specious. He could be dismissed from the chutzner at any time. But if that's not the case, if Reuven cannot remove Tony from the chutzner because they have a lease agreement or whatever it is, then, says the Gra, he certainly does aser on Reuven and Shimon, and they would have to be maskir rishus from him. V'ayin masha harachnu bazeh b'siman shin pei daled b'bir halacha, says the Chavetz Chaim. I'm going to discuss this in detail in Siman shin pei daled in a bir halacha. We'll get there, Bez Hashem Yisparach. Maybe we'll discuss that bir halacha when we get there. So, let's just give a brief recap of this first halacha in today's shir. When you have an Eina Yehudi in a chutzner, if there's more than two Yidden living in the chutzner, and they're living in two separate houses, and they would aser on each other already, then if there's an Eina Yehudi living in the chutzner, they need to be maskir rishus from the Eina Yehudi. They need to go to the Eina Yehudi, make a deal with him. We are, so to speak, renting from you your rights in the chutzner. Now we could make it a Reuven Chatzeros, Reuven and Shimon. We could make it a Reuven Chatzeros. We have your rishus, Tony, as well, because we rented it from you. Now Tiltel becomes mutter of the chutzner. Now Reuven and Shimon could transfer from their houses to the chutzner to their houses, from one house to the other house, vice versa. If there's only one Yid and one Eina Yehudi in the chutzner, then the Eina Yehudi does not aser on the Yid. We look at him as not being there. He doesn't aser on the Yid. Why? It's not commonplace. Since it's not commonplace, the Gzeres Chachamim does not apply. The halacha that we learned today, what if there's Reuven and Shimon living in a chutzner? Reuven has another house in the chutzner. He has a rental property. He rented it out to an Eina Yehudi. If you look at Tony, the Eina Yehudi, as now being a resident in the chutzner, so then Reuven and Shimon have to be maskir rishus from Tony in order to make it a Reuven Chatzeros. If somehow you don't look at Tony as being a resident, then Reuven and Shimon can make it a Reuven Chatzeros without being maskir rishus from Tony. Says the Ramah, in this case you could ignore the Eina Yehudi. There's no need to be maskir rishus from the Eina Yehudi. Why? We see two reasons. One reason the Ramah brings from the Magid Mishnah, and if you look at the Magid Mishnah brings it from the Rashba, and that is that Reuven can make a very interesting argument. When I made this deal with Tony and I rented out the rental house to him, I didn't do it to hurt myself. I did it only to benefit myself. And therefore, I can argue that whatever rishus you wanted me to rent from him, I never rented it to him, so I could ignore him. Second reason, says the Mishnah Berurah in the name of the Rashba, is that weiter, this is an uncommon situation. It's not common that a Yid would rent out his rental property in a chotzer that he lives in to an Ein Yehudi. And therefore it's not commonplace. Since it's not commonplace, the Gzeira doesn't apply. Now, there's one interesting thing that I want to point out in the phraseology of the Ramah. Take a look at the words of the Ramah. Says the Ramah, Yisrael shehisker ayhishul beisa le'ena Yehudi. A Yisrael rented out or lent out his house to an Ein Yehudi. Einoi oiser alav. The Ein Yehudi does not aser on him. Doesn't aser on him? How about the other Bnei HaChotzer? Let's say you have living in a Chotzer, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, and now Reuven rented out his rental property to Tony. So what the Ramah should tell me is, Reuven rented out his rental property to an Ein Yehudi. The Ein Yehudi doesn't aser aleihem. It doesn't aser on them, on Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda could go make it a Reuven Chatzeres, and they don't have to worry about Tony. They don't have to be maskerishus from Tony, and he doesn't aser on them. What is this Ein Oiser Alav on him? And there's no case where it's only on him. Because remember, if the only Yid in the Chotzer is Reuven, if there's only two houses in the Chotzer, Reuven and a rental property, and Reuven rents out the rental property to Tony, well, in that case we have no Shaila. Because even if Tony is a resident of the Chotzer, so what? It's one Yid, one guy. The Takanas Chachamim doesn't apply. Right? It's not common. He doesn't have to be maskerishus from Tony. So the only time this halach of the Ramah applies is when there's more than one Yid. So it shouldn't say Ein Oiser Alav. It should say Ein Oiser Aleihem. This is the question that the Biur Halacha addresses right here in Dibra Maschel Ein Oiser Alav. Let's see how much of this Biur Halacha we could do. Says the Chavetz Chaim. First of all, upashut. It's very obvious that you can't take the Ramah at face value. You can't translate it literally. The lav dafka alav einay oiser. It's not only on Reuven that Tony doesn't aser. Elegam alacherim adarim shom einay oiser. He doesn't aser on Reuven. He also doesn't aser on Shimon. Right? Dim loiked, because if you're going to try to forward an argument not that way, let's say you'll try to make an argument like this. Reuven and Shimon live in the Chotzer. Reuven has a rental property. He rents it out to Tony. Now, Tony doesn't aser on Reuven. Why? Well, you could say, because Reuven has his argument. He has the Ramah's argument. Hey, I didn't rent it out to Tony so that he should hurt me. I didn't rent it out to him so that I should have to go have an argument with him about being masker rishus from him. I don't want to have to deal with it. But Shimon, I don't know, Shimon doesn't have that argument. Shimon didn't rent it out to Tony. I rented it out to Tony. Shimon, you deal with it. Maybe Shimon has to be masker rishus. Maybe the halacha would be that if Reuven and Shimon join in an Eruva Chatzeros, Reuven is sitting pretty. Reuven has an Eruva Chatzeros. He could be metaltal from his house to the Chotzer to his house. Fine, no problem, because he has a good Eruva Chatzeros. Why not? I made an Eruva Chatzeros with Shimon. Tony? I don't got to worry about Tony. He can't aser on me. I have my argument. I rented out to him to help me, not to hurt me. Shimon, you don't have that argument. Shimon, your Eruva Chatzeros is flawed. If you want to be able to use the Eruva Chatzeres that we made, you have to be maskerishus from Tony. You want to try to forward such an argument? Says the Chavetz Chaim, you cannot forward such an argument. Why? Continues to be our halacha. Dim loikein, because if you're not going to say like this, what does the Ramah mean, Ein Oiser Alav on Tony? It wouldn't be true. Why not? Because we had this concept earlier. If the halacha is going to be that Shimon is aser without being maskerishus from Tony, memele gam hu aser, that would make Reuven aser as well. Shahacherim oisrim alav. The very fact that Shimon would be aser is going to aser Reuven. Why is that? That's because of a concept that we learned earlier, and that is eruv shemai. An Eruv is called an Eruv. It joins everybody together, and it gives everybody the same status. But if you're going to tell me that Shimon is aser, and Shimon does not have an Eruv, unless he's masker rishus from Tony, but Reuven does have an Erev without being maskir rishus from Tony, then they're not mu'urav. Then they're not the same. One guy has an Erev. You're telling me Reuven has an Erev, and Shimon does not have an Erev. Now, you could have slight differences between the residents. We saw that in Shin Pei Aleph, right? Where Bittul Rishus, depending on exactly how the Bittul Rishus was done, there are different halachas that apply to different residents in the Chatzar, where they could be metaltal from and to, where they can't be metaltal from and to. Slight differences in halacha you can have, but they're still called me'urav. But over here, where one guy has an Erev and the other guy doesn't have an Erev, that's already not mu'urav. See, in Bittul Rishus also, the mevatel is really not part of the Erev, right? But over here, you're telling me that Reuven and Shimon, they joined in an Erev. But you're telling me that somehow the Erev doesn't work for Shimon and it does work for Reuven, says the Biur Halacha, that can't be. The rest of this Biur Halacha is also very interesting, but I don't know if we have time to do it. So let's go weiter and then we'll see. All right, so we did Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Zion. Now let's go weiter in the words of the Ramah, second line down. So the first case that we tackled was Reuven had a rental property and he rented it out to Tony. Okay. Avo, however, says the Ramah, Im habayis shel einoi Yehudi. Let's say there's a chotzer. And in this chotzer, Tony owns a house. Okay? Now, let's say you have Reuven, and you have Shimon, and you have Tony. Right now, Tony's a problem. If you want to make an Erev here, Reuven and Shimon have to be maskir rishus from Tony. So right now, Tony's a problem. But now let's see what happened. If Tony has a house, usechara Yisrael mimenu, now along comes Levi. Levi rents out Tony's house, but Tony is still there. Reuven rents out Tony's house. Ve'ena Yehudi dar babayis imoy. Tony, let's say it's a big house. It's a 6-bedroom house. Levi comes and rents out Tony's beautiful 6-bedroom house. But Tony is going to stay in the guest suite in the basement. So Tony's not leaving. Tony is still there. So again, Reuven has his house. Shimon has his house. Now there's Tony's 6-bedroom house. Levi comes, rents out Tony's 6-bedroom house. Tony's staying in the guest suite in the basement. What's the halacha now? Is Tony a problem or is Tony not a problem? Now, why are we clearing this shaila? I'll tell you why we're clearing the shaila. Well, high level, you've got Reuven. Now you have Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. You have 3 Yidden, and you have Tony, who's an Eini Yehudi. If you have 3 Yidden and 1 Eini Yehudi, they should need to be maskir rishus from Tony. But on the other hand, there's a mitigating factor. You know what that mitigating factor is? Levi is already being maskir rishus from Tony. Levi's renting out the house from Tony, right? Ein lecha maskir rishus gedola mizu. He has a rental agreement with Tony. Tony, you've got a 6-bedroom house. I'm renting the house. I'm leaving you the guest suite in the basement. But I'm renting the house. Maybe you could make an argument that now we could say that Levi was already maskir rishus from Tony, and now we could ignore Tony. Being maskir rishus was already accomplished. When you made the rental agreement on the house, included in the rental agreement was being maskir the rishus that you need to allow for the Eruv Chatzeres. That would be the argument. Says the Ramah, it doesn't fly. So again, let's see it inside. Avalim abayi shalena Yehudi, if the house is owned by Tony, usechara Yisrael mimenu, and the Yid rented it out from the Eini Yehudi. The Eini Yehudi dar babayis imoy, but the Eini Yehudi is still living in the house in the guest suite in the basement. Ein schiras habayis moyel leinyan schiras ha'erev. The rental agreement that Levi made with Tony to rent the house out from Tony does not include in it the necessary required schiras rishus to resolve the Eruv Chatzeros issue. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Avalam Abayis. Pirush. The explanation of this is the loy name of the schiras atzarich le'inyan heter tiltel nichlal b'schiras Abayis. You cannot argue that the rental agreement on the house includes in it the required rental of the schiras rishus to allow for an eruv chatzeros. And what would the argument be? The argument would be a little bit the flip of the halacha that we had in the opening halacha of today's shir. It would go like this. In the opening halacha, we said that Reuven, when he rents out his house to Tony, says, wait a second, everybody understands. I rented out the house to Tony to help me, not to hurt me. Well, over here, we can make a similar argument in the other way. Mishum, the umduna de muchachu, it's obvious, it's something everybody should understand. Shaloi sacher bimenu abayis. Levi says, what? You think when I made the rental agreement with Tony to rent out the 6-bedroom house, you think I made an imperfect rental agreement? Shaloi sacher bimenu abayis adaita shia asr l'taltal b'Shabbos. What? You think I rented out a house from Tony in this beautiful chutzner? So with an imperfect rental agreement, that will mean that on Shabbos afternoon, I can't take my mishnayos outside to the chutzner for the Pirkei Avos drasha? What, you meshuga? I wouldn't make such an imperfect rental agreement. Obviously, when I made the rental agreement, I meant to rent from Levi whatever the rishus is that we need to rent from Levi in the world of eruv chatzeros, that being maskir rishus. I included it in my rental agreement. That would be the argument. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, you can't make that argument, right? That's part of the argument, right? You can't say, what? You think I made an imperfect agreement? No, I included it. And therefore, I shouldn't have to be maskir rishos from the Yaakov anymore. Kamash Balon, the Ramos teacher we know, we don't say this. Rak b'maskir v'loy basoicher. We could make that argument in the opening halacha of the Ramah. Reuven, a maskir, who's renting out to the Eini Yehudi, could make the argument, I did not rent him that rishus that would aser on me. But you cannot make that rishus, that argument by a soicher. By Levi, who's renting from the Eini Yehudi, you cannot say, I took from him in the rental agreement that ambiguous rishus so that I should be mutter to transfer in the chutzner. The argument does not work in both directions. And therefore, tzarich liskar bimenu rishusai, and therefore you still have to be maskir rishus from the Eini Yehudi from Tony. Now, the Ramah couched this case, and he said that in this case, Levi rented Tony's house, but Tony is still staying in the house. Tony lives in the guest suite in the basement. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's v'nochri. The Ramah is a little bit ambiguous. The Ramah said that you rented it from the Eini Yehudi, the Eini Yehudi, the Nochri, dar babayis imoi, is living in the house with him. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's hanochri hamaskir. We're talking about Tony, the owner of the house. Oiskan yud babayis imoi. He's living in the house with Levi. Umayri. Now, we're discussing a very specific case, says the Mishnah Berurah. Umayri sheyesh lo laha'akom cheder miyuchad. The Tony, the Nachri, is remaining in the house, but he has his own private quarters. He's in the guest suite in the basement. And the Yisrael, Levi, who's renting the house, has no right to go into the guest suite. So when Levi made the deal to rent out the 6-bedroom house from Tony, it was very clear. Yeah, Levi, you're getting the whole house, with the exception of the guest suite in the basement. The guest suite in the basement, I'm keeping for myself. Tony says, I'm living there. You got no business coming in there. That's mine. Has to be that way. That's when this halacha is true, that Tony remains a problem, and you need to be maskir rishus from Tony. But if not that way, says the Mishnah Berurah, if the way it worked was, Levi rented out the entire house, including the guest suite. Tony said, listen, you mind if I hang on? I mean, you don't need the guest suite right now. I mean, you've got 3 kids. You're not using the guest suite. I'm renting you the whole house, including the guest suite. Right now I need a place. You mind if I hang around and I stay in the guest suite? Levi says, no, go ahead. But in that case, Levi still has rights to the guest suite. He rented the whole house. And that means that Levi has the right to go in there whenever he wants. right? He could walk in there, knock at the door, hey, Tony, how you doing? He could walk in, and because, what do you mean? It belongs to Levi. He rented out the whole house, including the guest suite. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, in that case, Levi, who's renting out the house, is no less than schiroi, an employee of Tony's, or likitoi. Likitoi is like a harvester, somebody who's a seasonal employee. And then the other residents of the chutzner would not have to be maskir rishus from Tony. I'll tell you what this means in a second. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is very simple. We're going to learn later on. Let's say you have the Eina Yehudi living in the chutzner, and you need to be maskir rishus from him. But the Eina Yehudi who owns the house is a shver baldover. He's a hard guy to deal with. He's one of these tough guys. And you know that if you go over to him and you say, hey, Tony, listen, we got a problem with Jewish law. Tony's going to cut you off. You say, you know what? I'm not interested in your Jewish problems. I don't want to hear about it. And he's going to turn around and walk away. So you don't know how to deal with this guy. There's no way you're going to be able to be maskir rishus from him. So the halakha is going to give us several different options. Maybe you could be maskir rishus from his wife. Maybe you could be maskir rishus from his teenage daughter, like I told you happened with me. There's also an option of being maskir rishus from schiroi ulikitoi. If Tony has an employee who lives in his house, or even if it's a seasonal employee who lives in his house, there's a kula we're going to see that you could even be maskir rishus from them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what's the case that we're talking about here? If the case that we're talking about over here is that Tony rented out the whole house, including the guest suite in the basement, to Levi, and Tony is just hanging on in the guest suite, right? Well, then that means that Levi has rights in the entire house. If Levi has rights in the entire house, don't tell me that Levi, the renter, he has less authority and less power than schiroi ulikitoi, than an employee or a seasonal employee of Tony's. If an employee or a seasonal employee of Tony's can do the maskir rishus, if they could rent out Tony's rishus without Tony's knowledge, then certainly Levi can. So then we don't need the Ramah to tell me, oh, listen, in such a case, the guy is going to be a problem. No, the guy is not going to be a problem. You know why the guy is not going to be a problem? Because nobody has to deal with the guy. Levi is going to join the Yeruva Chatzeros with Reuven, Shimon, and Yehuda. When he does so, he's effectively taking Tony's rishus and combining it in the Erev. And he has the right to do that because he's at least as powerful as schiroi ulikitoi. Right? So then I don't need the Ramah's halacha. So when do I need the Ramah's halacha? I need the Ramah's halacha because the guy is very independent. The guy has his own quarters, the guest suite in the basement. And Levi has no rights to the guest suite in the basement. So in essence, Tony is still a resident of the chutzner. He's got his own private apartment in the chutzner. In such a case, the only argument to exclude Tony is Levi's attempted claim that when I rented out the house from Tony, with the exception of the guest suite, I included in that rental agreement that I'm renting from him whatever I need to rent from him, the rishus that I need to rent from him for the halachas of a Yeruva Chatzeros, and that, the Ramah says, is a specious argument. You don't get to make that argument, and it doesn't work, so you have to be a maskir rishus from Tony. Okay. Next halacha. 3 lines down. Wow, it's a fascinating sif, this sif. Next halacha, 3 lines down, by the Ois Katan Yud Aleph of the Mishnah Berurah, says the Ramah. Yisrael shehishil oihisker bayis lechaveroi. A yid who lends out or rents out his house to his friend. B'mokim shedarim einam Yehudim. In a place where there are also einam Yehudim. Let's go right away to Mishnah Berurah's Katan Yud Aleph and see what this is talking about. What the Ramah wants to say, the case that he wants to address is as follows. Sheyisrael yesh lo shnei batim b'chotzer she'ena Yehudi darba. Okay, you've got a chotzer with 3 houses. Okay, Ruvain lives in one house. Ruvain has a rental property also in the chutzner. That's up for rent. Then there's a third house in the chutzner, Tony. Okay, so let's do the math. Right now, let's say you have Ruvain in his house, Tony in his house, and Ruvain's rental property is empty. All right, it's one yid, one guy, no problem. The guy doesn't daser on the yid. It's only one guy and one yid. No eruv necessary, no schiras rishos, no anything. All right. Reuven goes ahead and he rents out the rental house to Shimon. Oh, now you've got Reuven and Shimon and Tony. Now you've got two yidden in two separate houses, and you've got Tony. Reuven and Shimon already aser on each other. Now Tony becomes a problem. Reuven and Shimon can make it a Reuven Chatzeros, but they need to be maskerishos from Tony. Says Reuven, not so fast. Not so fast. I rented out my rental property to Shimon, but I rented Shimon a furnished house. I rented him a furnished house with appliances and everything. So the refrigerator in Shimon's house is mine, the stove in Shimon's house is mine, the heavy furniture in Shimon's house is mine, all the furnishings, all the appliances in Shimon's house are mine. What does that mean in the context of a Reuven Chatzeros? Reuven says, I have a Tfisas Habayis in Shimon's house, right? It's all my house. It's all my stuff. Therefore, we learned earlier, when somebody has a Tfisas Habayis in another house, that house does not aser on him. So really, Reuven's arguing, Shimon doesn't aser on me. I have a Tfisas Habayis in Shimon's house. And therefore, not only Shimon doesn't aser on me, in reality, we're one resident. We're not two separate residences. There's me and me. I have a Tfisas Habayis in the other house. It's both me. So Reuven wants to argue, this is not two Yidden with a guy. This is one Yid with a guy. And therefore, we don't need an Reuven Chatzeros, and we don't need to be maskerishos. Does that work? That's the case that the Ramah is dealing with here. So now let's go back to the Ramah, and we'll see the Mishnah Berurah again. Says the Ramah, Yisrael shehisha lo hisker bayis lechaverei b'makom shedarim einam Yehudim. You have a guy, and you have a rental property. Reuven rented or lent out the rental property to Shimon. And now, af al pi sheyesh lo tfisa babayis lo mahani. Even though Reuven argues, I have a tfisa babayis in Shimon's house, and therefore we should call this one yid with a guy, not two yidden with a guy. Says the Ramah, that doesn't work. Utzrichem liskar be'ena Yehudi, they still have to be masker rishos from the Ena Yehudi. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Yisrael shehishel b'makom shedarim nachem v'tzayna laimar. What the Ramah wants to say is, Yisrael yesh lo shtei bata b'chotzer. Reuven has two houses in the chotzer. She'ena Yehudi darba, and there's also Tony living in the chotzer. V'hu darba bayis echad. Reuven lives in one of his houses. V'ashniya, and the second one of Reuven's houses, hiskir Yisrael acher. Reuven rented it out to Shimon. V'yesh lo b'bayis zeh tfisas yad. But Reuven has tfisas yad. Reuven has control in the house that he rented out to Shimon. Dahainu, meaning, shehishu by kalim she'enam nitalim b'Shabbos. Reuven owns kalim, let's say appliances, that cannot be removed from the rental property on Shabbos. He has a stove that can't be disconnected on Shabbos. He's got a refrigerator that can't be unplugged on Shabbos. So Reuven is a tfisas yad in the rental house that he rented out to Shimon. Umachmazeh, and because of that, ain't tzrichin la'arev beineim. Take the guy out of the picture. You have a chotzer with two houses. Reuven owns both houses. He lives in one house. He rents out the other furnished house to Shimon. Do they aser on each other? Do they have to make it a Reuven Chatzeros? No, because Reuven is a tfisas yad in the other house. So the other house doesn't aser on him. Kamoshin is barbasim and shenayin sif beis. The Kamash Balon, and the Ramah's teaching me. Ta'afilu hachi, still and all. Einam chashuvim kechad. We don't consider Reuven and Shimon like one. Utzrichem liska be'akum. We consider them two separate Yidden, and they need to be masker rishos from Tony. The tfisas yad, and here the Mishnah Berurah gives a very interesting explanation of why it is this way. Says the Mishnah Berurah, do the math. The tfisas yad lo odif be'im ervu beineim. What do you want to say? You want to argue that Reuven and Shimon don't represent two separate entities. Reuven says, I have a Tvisas Yad in Shimon's house. So me and Shimon are one. And therefore, we're one Yid with one guy. The guy doesn't answer on us. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that doesn't work. Because let's compare and contrast to another case. Forget Tvisas Yad. You have Reuven, who lives in his house in a chutzner. You've got Shimon, who lives in his house in a chutzner. Two separate houses, right? And then you've got Tony. Do they have to be maskerishos from Tony? Yes. Okay, hold it. Reuven and Shimon go and they make it Reuven Chatzeres. They buy a box of matzahs, they make it Reuven Chatzeres. Now they come and they argue, whoa, we're not two. We're one. We made an Erev. We joined in an Erev. We're not two, we're one. So we're one Yid and one guy. We don't need any Reuven Chatzeres. Does that argument hold water? No. Doesn't, right? So if the Erev cannot combine Reuven and Shimon to be seen as one unit against the Ein Yehudi, certainly Tvisas Yad is not more powerful than the Erev. So if Erev can't do it, Tvisas Yad can't do it. The Tvisas Yad lo yodef b'yem Erev b'neihem she'einem moil kozman shelo yisachu min ha'akum. Erev doesn't work without Schiras Rishus. K'mon shekasavdu b'sif katan dalid ayin b'biur halacha ma shekasavdu b'zeh. There's an interesting biur halacha. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Let's do Sif Beis. 2 lines off the bottom says the Mechaber. In Bitlu, this is also just such an interesting Sif. In Bitlu ha-Yisraelim rishusam le'echad mehem kedei sheyichoshev ki yechidi eitz aloyin Yehudi einoi moil. If the Yidden that live in the Chutzner, so you've got Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. You have 4 Yidden living in the Chutzner, and then Tony. And they don't want to go through the trouble of being maskerishos from Tony. Tony's the tough guy. They can't deal with him. So they've given up. We can't be maskerishos from Tony. What can we do? Oh, you know what we'll do? Hey, we learned Shin Pei Aleph. I'll tell you what we'll do. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are going to be mevatel rishus to Yehuda. Okay? So Reuven goes over to Yehuda. I'm being mevatel rishus, my rishus in the chutzner to you. Shimon goes to Yehuda. I'm mevatel my rishus in the chutzner to you. Levi goes to Yehuda. I'm mevatel my rishus in the chutzner to you. Okay? Now Yehuda is the only Yid that has rights in the chutzner. Right? Now, Yehuda argues, now it's me and the guy. It's me and the guy. I've got my rishus, and then there's the guy. Now, what is he trying to accomplish? What's he trying to accomplish? What he's trying to accomplish is, now Yehuda, if Yehuda's making a kiddush, that Shabbos, Yehuda can take the cholent, the kugel, the kichel, the herring, and the lemonade, and the wine out from his house to the chutzner. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi can't transfer from their houses to the chutzner. They're the mevatlim. They're the ones that are being mevatel. Yehuda's the recipient of the rishus. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and Yehuda, they can't transfer from their houses because their houses are distinct. They're separate rishus hayachids from the chutzner. So they can't transfer to the chutzner or from the chutzner to their houses. But Yehuda could make the kiddush. Yehuda could transfer from his house to the chutzner. Tony? No, Yehuda says, what do you mean? It's me and Tony. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are out. They will mevatel rishus to me. They're gone. So it's just me and Tony. That's the argument that they're trying to make. Says the Mechaber, doesn't work. Einoi moil, it doesn't work. Says the Mishnah Berurah, a very interesting reason why it doesn't work. Alam de shachap, why it doesn't work. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kohen Gimel, Dim kain bitalta teres erev me oisei mavli. The halachas of erev are going to be forgotten in this chutzner. The word mavli, we're going to pretend that right now that it says chutzner. The Torah of mavli, the Torah of erev, is going to be forgotten about in this chutzner. Shaharei lo yitztarku liskar klal, because they're never going to make an erev. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda know that they cannot deal with Tony. So they're never going to attempt to make an erev, because they know that in order to make an erev, they have to be maskerishos from Tony. And they know that they can't be maskerishos from Tony. So what are they going to do? They're always going to do bittul rishus. This week, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are going to be mevatel rishus to Yehuda, because it's Yehuda's turn to make the kiddush. Next week, Reuven, Shimon, and Yehuda are going to be mevatel rishus to Levi, because it's Levi's turn to make the kiddush, etc., etc., etc. But they're always going to use bittul rishus. They're never going to use erev, because they know that they can't use erev, and therefore, bitalta toiras erev me oisoi mavu. Now, let's just finish the Mishnah Berurah and then we'll talk about this for a minute. Sharei lo yitztachu lizkar kal, v'yichlu tam levatal, v'yishakach teres erev. That's the problem that the Mishnah Berurah says there is over here. Now, we're usually not concerned with this problem. What do I mean by that? Let's take Tony out of the situation. You've got Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda in the Chotzer. They forgot to make an Erev. Now it's Shabbos. They forgot to make an Erev. It's Yehuda's turn to make an Erev. He needs to bring the kugel and the cholent and the lemonade from his house to the Chotzer. He can't because there's no Erev. What do? Bittul Rishus. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi will be Mavatal Rishus to Yehuda. And now Yehuda could bring the kichel and the herring and the cholent and the kugel from his house to the Chotzer. Do we say it doesn't work because, we're afraid, Bital the Torah's Erev min ha-Chotzer? No, we don't say that. Why? You know why? I'll tell you why. Because in that case, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda know that they messed up. They know that they goofed. They didn't make an Erev. And they know that they're getting hurt because they didn't make an Erev. They know that because they didn't make an Erev, they're going to do a b'diavad. They're going to rely on Bittul Rishus. And now that they're relying on Bittul Rishus, they're losing out. Why are they losing out? Because, Yehuda could transfer from his house to the Chotzer, but Reuven, Shimon, and Levi cannot transfer from their houses to the Chotzer. If they would have made an Erev, they would be able to. So they recognize that an Erev is better than Bittul Rishus. They recognize that Bittul Rishus is a subcategory kula in the world of Eruv Chatzeros. They're not going to forget Torah's Erev. Next week, they're going to try to make an Erev. But that's not true in this case. In this case, they don't see a possibility of making an Erev. They know that they have Tony in their Chotzer. They know that they cannot be Maskir Rishus from Tony. So they know that Erev is off the table. So in their world, the only Eitzah is Bittul Rishus. They're going to forget about Erev. Someone's going to say something to them. Can I ask you a shaila in Eruv Chatzeros? Reuven's going to say, Eruv Chatzeros, we don't deal with Eruv Chatzeros. We don't deal with Eruv Chatzeros. In our Chotzer, Bittul is the name of the game. We can't deal with Eruv Chatzeros. We have Tony. You have a shaila about Eruv Chatzeros, go ask somebody else. Go ask the people in the Chotzer next door. They deal with Eruv Chatzeros. We don't deal with Eruv Chatzeros. And therefore we're afraid. Bitalta Torah's Erev min ha-Chotzer. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The schus of Liman HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should say, Yeshua Sefuras Panas and Shidduchim Tolos in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Gold Tzedek B'Meir V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.